The snow was melting along the riverbank in Bavaria when they found it. A rusted metal case, sealed tight beneath 70 years of earth. Inside were photographs, a map marked in fading ink, and a small insignia bearing the black eagle of the Reich. It was evidence of something buried deeper than anyone imagined, a story erased before it could be told. Within days, the discovery drew historians, soldiers' descendants, and forensic teams to a forgotten site once codenamed Ashfall. What they uncovered would rewrite the quiet ending of World War II and expose the final secret of a dying regime. Chapter 1: The World Before the Fire. In the late 1930s, Europe breathed in uneasy silence. Cities still carried the scars of the Great War, shattered facades patched with new stone, men in cafes nursing the ghosts of lost limbs and lost sons. Across the continent, flags changed, borders blurred, and beneath every anthem was the echo of something darker, something waiting. Germany was a nation reborn and restless. Its people had been promised renewal, strength, and pride by a man whose voice filled stadiums and living rooms alike, Adolf Hitler. His words, sharpened by grievance and grandeur, painted a vision of destiny. Factories roared back to life. Soldiers marched again in perfect rhythm, and the world watched as the old wounds of Versailles were ripped open one speech at a time. In Britain, there was a tired calm, a nation that wanted peace more than principle. Men like Chamberlain held to diplomacy, to the hope that words could tame ambition. Across the Channel, France fortified its borders, building concrete walls against an enemy they hoped would never return. And in the East, Stalin watched and waited, tightening his grip on a people who had already forgotten the meaning of rest. But for the ordinary families scattered across Europe, bakers, teachers, farmers, the signs were subtle. Breadlines grew shorter. Radios hummed with propaganda disguised as news. Children learned new songs at school, songs of purity, strength, and sacrifice. A quiet fear threaded through the days, but few could name it. By 1938, the world was already shifting beneath their feet. Austria fell without a fight, its crowds cheering as the swastika replaced the old flags of empire. In the Sudetenland, German soldiers crossed borders disguised as liberators. For those who lived there, the change came not with bombs, but with whispers. Neighbors vanishing, names rewritten, histories erased one file at a time. Even as the storm gathered, life went on. Women queued for milk, train whistles cut through morning fog, and somewhere in the Bavarian countryside, a small research facility began receiving new shipments under military escort, crates marked only with the initials AF and stamped Reichssicherheitshauptamt. The few who worked there said little. They were told it was for the future, for the protection of the fatherland. The papers called it a time of recovery, but the air was heavy with something unspoken, an exhaustion born not of peace, but of waiting. Europe was rebuilding, yet beneath the surface, governments sharpened weapons. Scientists pushed boundaries once considered unthinkable, and a new kind of war, fought with fear and ideology, had already begun. The world before the fire still believed in the illusion of control, but in quiet labs and border outposts, men in uniform were preparing for a conflict that would burn everything, not just cities and armies, but truth itself. Chapter 2: The Descent into War. The first shots of the new war were not fired with rifles, but with signatures. On the first day of September 1939, as dawn broke over Poland, the roar of engines shattered the quiet fields near Wielun. Bombers darkened the morning sky. Villages erupted in flame. The German war machine, fast, precise, relentless, rolled eastward. For the world, the illusion of diplomacy collapsed overnight. Within 48 hours, Britain and France declared war, but their words felt hollow against the thunder of blitzkrieg. From Warsaw to the Baltic coast, the Wehrmacht advanced like a tide. Refugees flooded the roads, farmers pushing carts, children carrying bundles larger than themselves. And in the chaos, a new kind of order took shape. Lists, directives, identifications, names on paper, marked for separation. As German banners rose across Europe, the Nazi High Command began its second war, not for land, but for information. Intelligence bureaus swelled with scientists, mathematicians, and codebreakers. Beneath the Reich Main Security Office in Berlin, an experimental division known as Abteilung 15 was formed. Its mission: to uncover, to analyze, and to weaponize knowledge. Every captured document, every intercepted message, every whisper became a potential weapon. In private journals, senior officers wrote of a project designed to secure Germany's post-war supremacy, a network of research stations operating beyond the reach of the front lines. One of these stations, hidden among the forests of Bavaria, carried the codename Ashfall. Officially, it did not exist, yet shipments of chemicals, computing equipment, and classified personnel moved there under orders signed by men whose names were later erased from history. Meanwhile, the Allies scrambled to understand the enemy they faced. British intelligence struggled to break German ciphers, while American envoys debated whether this was their war to join. Winston Churchill, then newly returned to power, warned Parliament, "You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth." His voice carried urgency, but exhaustion too. Everywhere, fear became policy. In Moscow, Stalin watched the growing storm with suspicion and opportunity. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed only weeks before the invasion, carved Poland like a carcass between wolves. German and Soviet officers met on bridges, exchanging salutes as their troops occupied opposite sides of the same river. It was a photograph of cynicism and of the fragile lies holding Europe together. By 1940, the war had consumed the continent. Denmark and Norway fell in days. France crumbled in 6 weeks. Across the Channel, Britain braced for invasion. In cities like London and Coventry, people painted their windows black, learned to sleep beneath sirens. The smell of smoke and dust became the scent of survival. But in hidden chambers, another kind of experiment unfolded. German scientists, working under the cloak of military necessity, pursued technologies years ahead of their time: magnetic propulsion, radar interference, and biochemical testing that blurred the line between research and atrocity. The Bavarian site, Ashfall, became a nexus for these operations. Its data was reported directly to Berlin under the codename Project Morgenrot. Few outside the Reich's scientific circles ever knew what those researchers were truly building. Rumors spoke of attempts to manipulate atmospheric pressure, to control visibility over battlefields, even to accelerate healing in soldiers through extreme biological conditioning. None of it was officially acknowledged. And yet, among captured archives recovered decades later, there would appear fragments, letters, requisition orders, notes scrawled in panic. "It's not working. The air burns. Shut it down." The descent into war was not just a march of armies. It was the collapse of restraint. Every nation, in its fear, reached for power beyond its own comprehension. Men told themselves they were defending civilization, but in laboratories buried beneath forests, behind the slogans and speeches, a darker truth was already taking root. War, once begun, has a way of feeding on secrecy, and by the end of 1941, as the world divided into Axis and Allied fronts, both sides were racing not only to win the war, but to own whatever knowledge might define the next one. Chapter 3: The Fire at Ashfall. The winter of 1944 was colder than memory. Snow fell thick across the Bavarian hills, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. For months, the Allies had been closing in, the Reich collapsing inward on itself like a dying star. Yet deep within the forest outside Berchtesgaden, one facility still operated under full power, a site that even nearby villagers only knew as the restricted zone. Inside the underground compound of Ashfall, time felt suspended. Corridors hummed with generators, the air sharp with ozone and chemical residue. Technicians in grey uniforms moved between sealed chambers, their faces pale under the blue glow of arc lamps. At the centre of it all stood the chamber they called the Cradle, a reinforced steel room fitted with conduits, turbines, and copper coils as thick as a man's arm. Every night the same order was given: test sequence, ignition, observation. The project's director, Dr. Ernst Keller, had once been a university physicist. Now he worked under SS supervision, his research twisted into something far beyond theory. His notes, later recovered by Allied investigators, described the goal in cryptic terms: localized energy manipulation for atmospheric disruption. But the meaning, stripped of its euphemisms, was simpler. They were trying to weaponize the weather. Outside, Allied forces advanced through southern Germany. The front was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Commanders in Berlin sent panicked orders: destroy all evidence. But Keller refused. "We are on the verge of control. he told his superiors in a final encrypted transmission. And control means victory, if not for this war, for the next. On the night of April 25, 1945, Ashfall initiated its last test. Witnesses, a handful of surviving guards and technicians, would later describe the moment in fragmented testimony. The generators screamed beyond safe limits. Instruments failed. A tremor rippled through the mountain itself. Then came the flash, white, silent, and blinding. When the smoke cleared, half the facility was gone. Concrete walls had peeled open like paper. Fire poured through ventilation shafts, igniting fuel stores and communications lines. Men staggered into the snow, their uniforms burning, their eyes seared from the light. Those who could still run fled toward the trees. Those who couldn't simply vanished beneath falling debris. Nearby villagers heard the explosion, but assumed it was an air raid. By morning, the forest smoldered, and the sky above bore a strange copper tint that lingered for hours. No Allied bombs had fallen there. Yet within days, reconnaissance aircraft recorded an anomaly. A circular scorch pattern visible from the air, radiating out nearly half a kilometre. When American troops reached the site in early May, the war in Europe was all but over. What they found inside the ruins defied standard reporting. Equipment melted into the floor, walls warped by heat that had no visible source, and in a storage wing, sealed behind reinforced doors, hundreds of documents, charred at the edges, stamped Project Morgenrot. The officers who led the recovery filed their findings under restricted access. Some of the surviving scientists were quietly taken into custody. Officially, they were interrogated for intelligence value. Unofficially, they were offered a choice: prosecution or cooperation. Most chose the latter. Within a year, many of those names reappeared under Operation Paperclip, absorbed into American research programs. The locals were told it had been a munitions accident. The forest was sealed off for decades, declared hazardous due to unexploded ordnance. Yet hunters and hikers who strayed too close spoke of strange magnetic disturbances, compasses spinning wildly, even dead zones where radios fell silent. Few believed them. The fire at Ashfall marked the quiet end of a secret war. One fought not with tanks, but with knowledge too dangerous to claim. Whatever Keller's team had unleashed that night, it was buried with them, or so it seemed. But history has a way of unearthing its own evidence. And when the snow began to melt again, 70 years later, the past started breathing through the cracks. Chapter 4: The Silence After the Storm. When the guns finally went quiet in May of 1945, the air across Europe was heavy. Not with victory, but with disbelief. Cities lay in ruin. Rivers carried the debris of empires. Survivors stepped out of cellars and forests, blinking into the pale sunlight of peace, unsure what that word even meant anymore. In Bavaria, the smouldering ruins of the Ashfall facility sank beneath the soil. Locals avoided the place. Soldiers stationed nearby spoke of headaches, nausea, strange electrical interference in their radios. Commanders dismissed it all as nerves. The war was over, and the world was eager to move on. But for the few who had seen the site firsthand, engineers, intelligence officers, and a handful of Allied scientists, the image would never fade. The warped steel, the twisted machinery, the fragments of research logs written in a mix of German and scientific shorthand. Some words underlined 3 times. Resonance instability, atmospheric ignition, do not repeat. As Europe rebuilt, the machinery of secrecy turned faster than ever. The newly formed Allied Control Council gathered truckloads of captured German research and divided it like spoils. Anything that hinted at advanced technology was shipped west to the United States or Britain. Soviet agents seized the rest. Within a year, both sides were scouring the ashes of the Reich not for gold, but for knowledge. Many of the Ashfall scientists vanished into this system. Dr. Keller's name appeared once in a US Army report from 1946, then disappeared entirely. A later file, declassified decades after, mentioned his transfer to Research Division 10, Project S. The meaning of that single letter remains classified. Meanwhile, in nearby towns, the memory of Ashfall dissolved into rumour. Children grew up hearing stories of the burned mountain, of lights under the snow on moonless nights. Farmers swore that nothing would grow near the crater. Over time, the forest reclaimed the land, sealing the past under roots and moss. Across the world, new wars began. Smaller, colder, quieter. Berlin split in two. The Iron Curtain descended. The same powers that had once united to defeat tyranny now eyed each other across borders lined with wire and fear. Yet somewhere in that growing silence, both sides carried pieces of the same legacy. Data, blueprints, fragments of Ashfall's ambition. Through the 1950s and 60s, the shadow of that research lingered. In Nevada, scientists tested cloud seeding for military weather control. In Siberia, Soviet teams experimented with atmospheric resonance, words that mirrored Keller's final notes almost exactly. Officially, these were new discoveries. Unofficially, they were echoes. For the survivors of the war, life moved forward in fits and starts. Widows remarried, cities were rebuilt from rubble, children were born into a peace that never felt complete. But beneath that fragile normalcy lay a quiet agreement that some things would remain buried. Archivists who stumbled on references to Project Morgenrot were told to leave them alone. Reports went missing. Files were stamped "destroyed by order." Those who asked too many questions were transferred to other departments or retired early. The silence was deliberate, and yet history has a way of whispering through time. In the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union began to fracture, fragments of the old intelligence networks surfaced again. A cache of microfilm recovered in Prague listed over a dozen undisclosed wartime research sites. One, marked only with an A, matched the Bavarian coordinates. Still, no one went looking. The Cold War had produced enough ghosts of its own. No government wanted to dig up another. So the mountain slept, its scars hidden beneath decades of frost and roots. But silence is never permanent. Somewhere in a government vault, a classified memo circulated among NATO's science division in the early 2000s. The subject line was brief: residual electromagnetic signatures, Berchtesgaden sector. Attached were aerial images showing faint circular patterns beneath the forest floor. It was a reminder that even after the greatest storms, some fires never truly die. They smolder in secrecy, waiting for a curious hand, a restless question, a moment when history dares to look again. And in that stillness, under a century's worth of silence, the world's most dangerous experiment waited to be rediscovered. Chapter 5: Shadows That Still Remain. By the time the metal case was unearthed in 2015, most who had lived through the war were gone. What remained were their descendants, sons, daughters, and grandchildren, raised in the long shadow of their choices. The discovery came almost by accident. A floodplain erosion after a particularly harsh winter revealed a corner of rusted steel jutting from the soil. When historians opened it, the smell of age and oil filled the air. Inside were Keller's surviving documents, and a single undeveloped film roll labeled Test 14. The footage, restored frame by frame, showed what words had failed to describe. A circular array of machinery, men in heavy coats adjusting dials, a pulse of light, and then distortion, as if the very air folded inward. The film cut off abruptly, melted by the intensity of its own recording. Forensic analysis later confirmed it had not been edited. Whatever happened at Ashfall that night was real. News of the find spread quickly, though quietly. Governments issued brief statements calling it historically significant but inconclusive. Yet behind closed doors, teams of physicists and intelligence officers reviewed the footage in silence. Some saw proof of an early experiment in high-frequency resonance. Others saw something far more unsettling: evidence that the limits of wartime science had gone further than anyone had admitted. The rediscovery reignited an old debate. How much of modern science was born from buried crimes? Documents linked to Operation Paperclip revealed that at least 3 scientists from the Ashfall network had later contributed to early US atmospheric testing. In Moscow, declassified files hinted that similar data had reached the Soviets through defectors. The same experiment, repeated under new flags, new names, and new promises. For the villagers near Berchtesgaden, the attention brought unease. Researchers arrived with drones and ground-penetrating radar. They found traces of melted metal far below the surface, fused into the rock. Radiation levels were normal, but magnetic readings fluctuated wildly. One of the surveyors described the feeling as standing inside a memory that doesn't want to be remembered. Interviews with descendants of those who had worked at the facility painted a picture of quiet guilt. Some recalled fathers who never spoke of the war, only warned their children never to dig near the old forest. Others had kept letters, coded, fragmented, but filled with fear. One note read simply, "We opened something we could not close." As documentaries, podcasts, and historians revisited the mystery, public fascination grew. Yet no definitive answers emerged. The Bavarian government sealed the site once again, citing safety concerns. The excavation teams were reassigned, and within a year, the coordinates were removed from official mapping databases. Still, the questions remain. How far were those scientists willing to go in their pursuit of control? What did Keller truly discover before the flames consumed his lab? And how much of that knowledge, filtered through decades of Cold War secrecy, still shapes the invisible technologies that define our world today? History rarely ends neatly. It drifts, unfinished, from one generation to the next. A series of echoes fading, but never gone. The war may have ended in 1945, but its experiments, its secrets, its moral fractures continue to ripple outward. When the camera pans over the forest now, there is nothing to see, just trees, wind, and silence. But beneath the soil, in the iron bones of a forgotten bunker, lies the residue of ambition, and the warning that some truths, once uncovered, demand to be faced. The past does not stay buried. It waits, patient, persistent, and unblinking. In the ashes of forgotten wars, it whispers the same question again and again. What price are we still paying? For the knowledge we were never meant to find.